What if the most important question in scientific artificial intelligence is no longer whether a model can generate a new idea? What if the harder question is whether science has enough infrastructure to validate all the ideas those systems can now produce? That distinction matters because a candidate is not a discovery. A molecule design is not a medicine, a hypothesis is not a result, an experimental workflow is not a verified finding. It becomes science only after it passes through validation, testing, reproduction, peer review, lab capacity, institutional trust, and the judgment of people and systems that decide what deserves to move forward. This is the discovery bottleneck. For years, the public story about artificial intelligence in science has focused on intelligence. Can the model read the literature? Can it detect a pattern? Can it summarize papers? Can it help a researcher find a signal in a flood of data? Those capabilities matter, but they describe artificial intelligence as an assistant inside an existing scientific process. The newer pattern is different. Some scientific artificial intelligence systems are beginning to produce structured candidates, possible molecules, mechanisms, hypotheses, experiments, and workflows. That does not mean they have solved science. It does not mean they replace scientists. It does not mean every generated candidate is valid. It means the output class has changed. The system is no longer only helping humans navigate what already exists. It is producing candidates for what might be true. That shift creates an infrastructure question. If artificial intelligence can generate plausible scientific candidates faster than science can validate them, then the constraint moves away from the model alone and toward the systems that decide which candidates are credible enough to test, reproduce, fund, publish, or build on. That is the central argument of this episode. Discovery is becoming an infrastructure problem, not because intelligence stops mattering. Models, data, compute, and training methods still determine what can be generated. But intelligence is only one part of the system. The next constraint may be validation. The research behind this episode frames the change as a shift from scientific assistance to candidate generation. The important point is not that any one system proves the future of science. The point is that several early systems illustrate the gap between generated candidates and validated knowledge. EVO2 is one example, an early signal of model-generated molecular and biological candidates. The safe claim is not that it produces validated therapeutics. The safe claim is that candidate structures still require independent testing. Google Artificial Intelligence Co-Scientist is another example, an early signal of hypothesis and workflow generation being explored. The safe claim is not that it replaces researchers. The safe claim is that artificial intelligence output can take the form of structured scientific proposals. FutureHouse Robin is useful as an early lab-in-the-loop example because it makes the validation layer visible. The loop matters. The laboratory is not decorative. It is the gate where candidate generation meets measurement, material constraints, and real results. These systems are examples of workflows being explored, not proof of a universal transformation. They operate in different domains with different architectures and different evidence limits, but they point toward one shared pressure. Generated candidates still have to pass through validation systems that are slower, more physical, more institutional, and more trust-dependent than the models producing the candidates. That mismatch is the pressure point. The easiest mistake is to describe this as simple acceleration. Artificial intelligence accelerates research. Artificial intelligence speeds up discovery. Artificial intelligence makes scientists more productive. Some of that may be true, but acceleration in one part of a pipeline does not automatically accelerate the whole pipeline. If one stage becomes faster while the next stage stays slow, the constraint moves downstream. A factory can produce more parts than its inspection stations can check. A hospital can receive more patients than its operating rooms can handle. A model can generate more candidate hypotheses than the validation system can responsibly evaluate. In each case, the constraint determines throughput. The limiting layer decides what actually passes through. In scientific discovery, validation is not one step. It is a stack. First, candidate generation. The model proposes something that might be worth testing. Second, experimental validation. The proposal meets measurement, experiments, instruments, and domain constraints. Third, reproducibility. Another lab, tool chain, or workflow can check whether the result survives beyond the first run. Fourth, Institutional trust, reviewers, funders, journals, labs, and standards bodies decide whether the evidence is strong enough to enter the shared record. Fifth, adoption into durable knowledge. Other researchers can safely build on the result without treating it as a fragile one-off signal. Each layer has a different constraint. Data quality is not lab capacity. Lab capacity is not peer review. Peer review is not reproducibility. Reproducibility is not trust. Practical question is whether these layers connect smoothly enough for generated candidates to move from possibility to evidence without losing reliability along the way. This is why the validation layer matters. Validation is not a cleanup step after discovery. It is part of the discovery system itself. If the validation layer cannot absorb, filter, reproduce, and credential what the generation layer produces, then scientific acceleration turns into a queue. When candidate volume rises, triage becomes power. If 1,000 plausible candidates arrive and only a small number can be evaluated deeply, the system that chooses those candidates shapes what labs spend time on, what funders see, what reviewers encounter, and what eventually enters the literature. That is not a conspiracy claim, it is a systems claim. When capacity is limited, selection rules matter. This is where the topic becomes bigger than any single model. The frontier question is not only who has the best scientific artificial intelligence model, it is also who has the best discovery infrastructure, who can connect generation to verification, who can track provenance, who can run reliable partial checks, who can route candidates to the right labs, who can decide which generated proposals deserve expensive physical testing, who can produce evidence that other institutions trust. The advantage may shift toward institutions that connect generated ideas to validated knowledge with less waste, more transparency, and higher credibility. That is a different race. It is a race in reproducibility pipelines, lab automation, peer review augmentation, data quality, workflow standards, computational credentials, and institutional throughput. It is also a race in humility, because the wrong validation system can make artificial intelligence discovery look more certain than it is. This is where overclaiming becomes dangerous. A generated candidate can look scientific without being true. It can use the right vocabulary, cite the right domain, and fit an appealing pattern. But if the evidence chain is weak, the candidate is still only a candidate. More hypotheses do not automatically mean more knowledge. More plausible outputs can also mean more things to check. What we can call validation debt is the backlog of plausible candidates whose evidence chains have not yet been evaluated. It does not always look dramatic. It can look like unread proposals, overloaded reviewers, duplicated experiments, or labs spending scarce time on candidates that were never properly triaged. It can look like institutions trusting a benchmark, a workflow, or a generated explanation before the evidence chain is strong enough. The problem is not that artificial intelligence is wrong by default. The problem is that truth still has a cost. Someone has to test, someone has to reproduce, someone has to audit the data, someone has to decide what deserves scarce experimental capacity. And in many domains, the physical world refuses to move at software speed. That is why lab-in-the-loop systems are so useful as signals. They show both the promise and the constraint. A model can propose, the lab still measures, a system can generate, the experiment still answers. The loop is not a weakness. It is where candidate science meets reality. The same logic applies to peer review. Peer review can be slow and uneven, but it serves a deeper function, converting private or local claims into claims a field is willing to treat as part of the shared record. If artificial intelligence increases the volume of candidate papers, methods, and results, peer review does not disappear. It changes shape. It may need assistance, filtering, reproducibility checks, better provenance systems, or new credential layers. But the question remains, what makes a claim trusted? That question cannot be answered by generation alone. This is the reframing at the center of the discovery bottleneck. The future of scientific artificial intelligence may depend less on a single breakthrough model than on the systems that surround generated intelligence. A discovery pipeline has many layers, models, data, compute, instruments, labs, reviewers, journals, funders, standards, replication networks, and institutional incentives. If one layer moves faster than the others, the slow layer determines the pace. That means discovery infrastructure becomes strategic, not glamorous, not always visible, but decisive. The verification format matters. The metadata matters. The reproducibility protocol matters. The lab routing system matters. The funding filter matters. The benchmark matters. The audit trail matters. The people who decide what counts as enough evidence matter. Artificial intelligence may generate the next possibility. Science still needs the infrastructure to decide what deserves to become real. There are important limits to this argument. This does not mean every field faces the same bottleneck in the same way. Validation pressure looks different across biology, materials, medicine, software, climate, mathematics, and engineering. Some domains have faster feedback loops. Some can run automated checks more easily. Some require expensive physical experiments. Some depend more heavily on peer review or institutional trust. The broader pattern is visible, but the exact throughput gap varies by domain. Artificial intelligence may also improve validation. Automated reproducibility checks, literature screening, statistical review, simulation pipelines, and lab automation could reduce parts of the constraint. If validation accelerates as fast as generation, the shape of the problem changes. Quality still matters too. A smaller number of better candidates may be easier to validate than a flood of weak ones. The issue is not volume alone, it is volume, plausibility, cost, and trust interacting in the same system. So the thesis should be held carefully. The claim is not that science is doomed by too many artificial intelligence ideas. The claim is that artificial intelligence discovery cannot be understood by looking at model capability alone. The central question becomes systemic. Can the discovery stack validate what the generation stack produces? If the answer is no, the limiting layer is validation. If the answer is yes, the advantage may shift toward institutions that build that validation capacity. Either way, the focus shifts, from intelligence alone to infrastructure, from generation alone to verification, from what models can propose to what science can trust, that is, the discovery bottleneck. A candidate can be generated by compute. A discovery has to pass through evidence, and the next phase of scientific artificial intelligence may be decided by the infrastructure between those 2 points. If you want more analysis on the infrastructure layer behind artificial intelligence progress, subscribe to Quantum Convergence.